The river lay still beneath a sky streaked in violet and gold, its current moving lazily as if the world itself had grown tired. Fireflies blinked along the reeds, and the low hum of cicadas filled the air. It was the kind of evening that felt timeless, until it wasn't. Help! Somebody help! A little girl just fell in. The shout ripped across the quiet like glass shattering on stone. Heads turned. Conversations cut off. The laughter of families spread along the bank froze in place. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then panic surged. Near the dock, ripples spread violently across the water. A small figure broke the surface, a girl, no older than 6. Her arms flailed, but the movements weren't free. Her wrists were bound with coarse rope, the knots biting into her skin. A gag dangled loose around her chin, slipping free with the water's pull, but her cries were muffled, swallowed by the river. The scene was grotesque in its contrast. An innocent child dressed in a simple yellow sundress, curls plastered to her forehead, thrashing against restraints that should never have touched her. She kicked, desperate, but every motion dragged her lower. Her eyes, wide, terrified, and pleading, caught the last glint of sunset before disappearing beneath the surface again. On the dock, 4 children stood rooted to the spot. White, privileged, and no older than 9, they weren't panicking. Not exactly. Their faces flickered between guilt and something darker, an excitement they didn't understand but couldn't hide. One boy whispered, voice sharp with regret, "We just pushed her a little. She can't swim." Another shuffled his feet, hugging himself, while the tallest forced a laugh that cracked under the weight of fear. "Don't say anything," he muttered. "She'll be fine. She'll float." But she wasn't floating. She was sinking. Around them, adults pressed closer, murmuring, "Is someone going to do something?" Their phones came out, hands shaking, but not a single body lunged forward. Maybe it was shock. Maybe it was fear of the dark water. But the girl floundered alone. Seconds stretched into eternities. The camera lingers. Every splash weaker than the last. Her little hands rose above the water, fingers spread wide as though trying to grasp the air itself. Then they vanished. Only bubbles remained, popping silently on the surface. The crowd gasped, voices breaking into chaotic noise. "Somebody go in. Where's her family? Lord, she's tied up." Still, no one moved. The stillness of the river mocked them, its surface closing over as if nothing had happened, as though it had claimed its prize. The gag drifted for a moment like a dead leaf, then sank. The rope pulled tighter with the weight of the water, dragging her down. Beneath the surface, her world was silence and burning lungs. She kicked, but the river was merciless, pulling her into its cold embrace. Her wide eyes searched for light. Her curls floated like seaweed around her head. For a moment, she stilled, tiny chest aching, limbs heavy, surrender brushing against her consciousness. Back on shore, tension mounted like a coiled spring. Mothers clutched their children closer, horrified. Fathers cursed under their breath. The children on the dock exchanged panicked glances, realization dawning too late that cruelty had consequences. But the river didn't care. The shot closes in tight, bubbles rise, then stop. A final glimpse of her hand, limp, slipping into the dark. Cut. Black screen. Silence. Then, one last gasp of air breaks through. The surface churns again. Her head rises, trembling, mouth open in a scream the world still cannot hear. Charles Whitmore walked along the far bend of the river, his polished shoes crunching against gravel, each step heavy with fatigue. The evening had offered him a brief reprieve from the suffocating boardroom he'd left behind, an empire built on contracts, mergers, and men who sharpened smiles like weapons. His tie hung loose, his jacket slung over one arm. To anyone watching, he looked every inch the billionaire at ease, but inside his chest, restlessness gnawed. Numbers still rattled in his mind, stock values, property disputes, shareholder demands. For all his wealth, the quiet never lasted. Silence left space for thoughts he'd rather drown in work. That was why he walked, to keep moving, to chase peace he could never quite catch. And then he heard it. The cry tore through the dusk, "Help! Somebody help!" He stopped cold. His head snapped toward the sound, his heart lurching. It wasn't the usual chaos of children playing, nor the casual panic of parents misplacing a toddler. This was primal. Desperate. Charles dropped his jacket, instincts taking command before reason caught up. His eyes scanned the crowd gathered near the dock, faces twisted in fear and indecision. Then he saw her, the small figure thrashing in the water, arms bound, head slipping beneath the current. For a fraction of a second, something in him froze. He had spent his life commanding boardrooms, not diving into rivers. The cold grip of hesitation clamped down. He didn't swim often, not since boyhood. What if he failed? What if he jumped and never resurfaced? But the thought lasted only a breath. Shoes kicked off, shirt ripped open at the collar, Charles ran. His body, older now, stiff from years of sitting in leather chairs and private jets, protested with every stride. But adrenaline drove him forward. The murmurs of the crowd blurred. The only sound that cut through was the desperate splash of a drowning child. At the edge of the dock, he leapt. The river swallowed him whole, icy teeth clamping down on his lungs. He gasped, but water rushed into his mouth, burning. Panic threatened, but discipline wrestled it back. Strong strokes cut through the current, his body remembering movements long buried under decades of neglect. His gaze locked on the girl, her tiny form slipping deeper into the murk. "Hold on," he muttered through clenched teeth, though she could not hear him. "I'm coming." Every muscle screamed as he reached out, fingers brushing her shoulder just as she sank. With one last surge, he wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her against him. She was limp, frighteningly light, her curls floating around her face like a dark halo. Her bound wrists tugged against his grip as though the river itself fought to reclaim her. Charles kicked hard, legs churning, chest burning for air. The current resisted, dragging them both down. For one terrible instant, he thought he would fail, that the water would drag them under and no amount of money or power would matter. But then his head broke the surface. He gulped in air, coughing violently, holding the girl high against his shoulder. The crowd erupted in shouts, part relief, part disbelief. "I've got you." His voice was hoarse, raw, but steady. "I've got you." He pushed toward the shore, every stroke carrying the weight of his own redemption. In that moment, Charles Whitmore was no longer the untouchable billionaire, the calculating magnate of glass towers and steel deals. He was simply a man fighting against the river, desperate to keep a fragile life from slipping away. And for the first time in years, his wealth, his empire, his pride, none of it mattered. Only she did. Charles staggered onto the muddy bank, lungs heaving, water streaming from his clothes. The crowd surged forward, gasps filling the air, but he barely heard them. All his focus fixed on the small girl in his arms. She lay limp against him, soaked sundress clinging to her frail body. Her wrists were raw where the rope had bitten into her skin, the coarse fibers still knotted cruelly tight. Her lips were tinged blue, her lashes heavy with river water. For one terrifying heartbeat, Charles thought he was too late. "No, no, no, come on," he muttered, dropping to his knees. He lowered her gently onto the grass, tilting her head back, pressing his ear close. A faint rasp. Barely there. But it was enough. Relief surged through him, sharp as pain. He pressed carefully at her chest, coaxing, commanding, pleading in the same breath. "Breathe, sweetheart. Come back to me. Just breathe." The crowd pressed closer, their murmurs a tangled chorus. "Is she alive? Look at her hands, tied. My God, who would do such a thing?" A boy from the dock whimpered, "We didn't mean it. She can't swim. We just pushed her." His words cracked like thin ice, his guilt spilling into the open. The adults turned on him, horrified, but Charles shut it out. All that mattered was the child. Then, movement. A sputter. The girl convulsed, coughing up river water that splashed against his shirt. She gagged, wheezed, then sucked in a shuddering breath. Her eyes fluttered open, wide and terrified. And then she whispered, weak and trembling, but unmistakable. "Daddy." The word pierced him deeper than any blade. He froze, staring down at her, his chest locking tight. Daddy? No one had called him that in years. His own daughter, gone before she ever had the chance, haunted the corridors of his past. He had buried that pain under towers of steel and glass. But now, hearing the word from this stranger's lips, something old and raw tore open inside him. "I've got you," he murmured, voice breaking despite himself. "You're safe now. I promise." Her small fingers clutched weakly at his collar, as if clinging to the only anchor she trusted. Her dark eyes glazed with exhaustion, but behind the fear shimmered something else, a plea, a question, a desperate search for someone who would not vanish. Charles ripped at the knots binding her wrists, fury rising with every tug. Rope gave way, leaving angry red grooves in her skin. The sight made his jaw tighten, his chest burn. What kind of cruelty would leave a child gagged and bound, tossed like refuse into the river? "Get an ambulance," he barked, his tone carrying the weight of a man used to being obeyed. Someone fumbled for their phone, dialing frantically. Charles peeled off his drenched shirt, wrapping it around the girl's trembling form. She shivered violently, curls plastered to her cheeks, lips quivering. He held her closer, his body heat her only shield against the night's chill. The sirens came minutes later, red and blue light painting the riverside in frantic color. Paramedics lifted her gently, voices professional but edged with urgency. As they settled her on the stretcher, her small hand reached blindly, searching, until it found his again. And with the last of her strength, she whispered the word once more, "Daddy," before her eyes slid shut. Charles Whitmore, billionaire, mogul, untouchable in the world of men, felt his chest crack under the weight of that single word. He didn't know who she was, or why fate had dragged him to this river at this hour. But in that moment, with the girl's fragile trust clinging to him like a lifeline, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He could not walk away. The hospital lights glowed sterile and unforgiving, but to Charles, the world had narrowed to the small bed in the pediatric ward. Machines hummed softly, monitors blinked with steady rhythm, and a frail figure lay beneath crisp white sheets. The girl, rescued, but not yet safe. She looked impossibly small against the expanse of pillows, her curls damp but beginning to fluff as they dried, her wrists swaddled in gauze. Every so often, her eyelids fluttered as though trapped in dreams she could not escape. Each time, Charles leaned forward, straining to catch her murmurs. And twice, soft as the brush of a moth's wing, she whispered it again, "Daddy." Each repetition landed differently. The first time had been shock, disbelief. The second carried something heavier. It was no longer an accident, no random slip of a frightened child. It was a claim. And though logic told him it couldn't be, Charles felt the word wrap around him like an invisible tether. When she stirred, the nurse helped guide her trembling hands to crayons and paper, small comforts to remind her she was still a child. She clutched the red one first, then blue, then green, and began to scrawl with shaky determination. Charles sat at her side, silent, waiting. When she held the page up, his throat tightened. It was crude, the lines jagged, the colors uneven. But unmistakable. Two stick figures, one small with curls, the other taller, broader, drawn in thick black strokes. At the bottom, in uneven letters, she had written, "Me and Daddy." His chest constricted, memories surging unbidden. A different woman's voice, years ago. A different promise, broken before it was ever kept. He had buried that past under the weight of skyscrapers and stock tickers. Yet here it was, staring at him in crayon, demanding to be remembered. "Do you like it?" Her small voice trembled, uncertain. Charles swallowed, forcing steadiness into his tone. "It's beautiful, sweetheart." She smiled faintly, a flicker of warmth in her otherwise shadowed eyes. Then she did something that nearly broke him. Without warning, she twisted her tiny fingers in the air, an absent gesture, as though turning an invisible band around her wrist. Charles froze. It was his gesture. A nervous tic he had carried since youth, a habit born in long nights of decision-making, turning cufflinks when he needed to think. And here it was, mirrored in miniature. Coincidence? Fate? Or something more? The nurse adjusted her blanket, reminding him gently, children cling to symbols. Things that feel safe. But Charles knew. This was more than safety. This was recognition. A bond unspoken, yet undeniable. Later, as night settled over the ward, Charles remained in the chair beside her bed. Executives could wait. Deadlines could collapse. For once, he did not care. She startled awake from a nightmare, gasping, eyes wide with terror. Before the nurses could move, she reached for him, small hands clutching his sleeve as though her life depended on it. "I've got you," he whispered, gathering her gently into his arms. She trembled against him, then slowly, her breathing evened, her head tucking into his chest. In the hush of the ward, with only the hiss of oxygen and the steady beep of monitors, Charles Whitmore held the girl as though she were the most valuable thing he had ever owned. Not property. Not stock. Not empire. Something far rarer. A child's trust. And though he had no answers, though questions clawed at him from every corner of his mind, he felt it deep in his bones. This was no coincidence. This was a bond. A symbol. A beginning. By morning, the hospital had settled into its routine hum. Nurses moved briskly between rooms, the scent of antiseptic clung to the air, and outside the wide windows, the river shimmered under a pale sun. Yet for Charles, the world inside room 12 felt anything but ordinary. The little girl, still unnamed to him, slept peacefully, her breaths shallow but steady. Charles had not left her side all night. Dark circles pooled under his eyes, but he remained alert, his posture stiff in the chair. For a man who measured life in transactions and control, the helplessness gnawed at him. Questions circled his mind like vultures. Who tied her up? Why was she alone? Where were her parents? Every answer led only to more unease. A knock at the door broke his spiral. A detective stepped in, tall, middle-aged, his expression firm but not unkind. "Mr. Whitmore, we're still piecing things together. No reports of a missing child match her description. No witnesses willing to say more than they already have. Whoever did this, wanted her gone without a trace." Charles's jaw tightened. That's unacceptable. She didn't just wander into that river. Someone put her there. The detective nodded gravely, but his eyes lingered on the sleeping child. "When she wakes, maybe she can tell us something." But for now, he trailed off, leaving the unspoken truth hanging in the air. When the detective left, Charles turned back to her, unwilling to let frustration show. She stirred soon after, blinking groggily. Her gaze found his instantly, as though he were the anchor she had been waiting for. "Daddy," she whispered again. The word was no longer a plea but a quiet declaration, certain and steady. Charles swallowed hard, torn between correcting her and accepting what the name stirred inside him. Instead, he asked softly, "What's your name, sweetheart?" She fumbled with the hospital bracelet on her wrist, pointing to the scribbled ink. The letters were smudged, but clear enough, Anna. The name hit him like a blow. Years ago, there had been another Anna. A name chosen in whispers with Monica, the woman he had once loved. The woman who had told him she was pregnant. The woman who vanished soon after, leaving only grief and silence. He had been told the child had died. That chapter was closed, buried beneath years of ambition and denial. But now, this girl. This Anna. Coincidence was possible. But so was something far more shattering. She twirled her fingers absent-mindedly, the same nervous tick he'd seen in himself countless times before. Watching her, Charles felt the cold logic of his world crumble, replaced by something both terrifying and exhilarating. Could she be his? He leaned closer, voice low, as if asking the question aloud might break the fragile thread binding them. "Who told you to call me Daddy?" Anna blinked, her small brow furrowing. "No one," she whispered. "I just knew." Her answer cut straight through him. Charles sat back, struggling to breathe evenly. The world outside continued as normal, phones rang, nurses laughed faintly down the hall, but inside the room, a storm gathered. The mystery was no longer just about the river, the ropes, the cruel children. It was deeper, personal. Was this girl the daughter he'd been told had never drawn breath? The question lodged in his chest, refusing to let go. And with it came another, darker thought: if she truly was his, then someone had not only stolen 6 years of her life, but 6 years of his as well. Someone had lied. Someone had hidden the truth. And that someone might still be watching. The sun dipped lower, throwing long shadows across the hospital courtyard. Charles stood at the window of Anna's room, staring down at the traffic that moved like restless ants below. His reflection in the glass looked older than he remembered, haunted, uncertain. He wasn't a man accustomed to uncertainty. Deals, markets, hostile takeovers, he thrived on clarity, on knowing every angle before his opponents. But this? A child who called him Daddy, a name that cut open scars he thought were long healed. And the gnawing sense that forces far darker than playground cruelty were at play. His phone buzzed. He almost ignored it, but habit won. The name flashing across the screen made his stomach tighten: Victor Kane. Victor had been his rival for years, a businessman as ruthless as he was cunning. Where Charles built, Victor sabotaged. Where Charles negotiated, Victor schemed. And lately, Victor's empire had begun to falter, his failed merger, his collapsing stock. Charles should have relished it. Instead, dread pooled in his gut. "Whitmore," Victor's voice oozed through the speaker, smooth and taunting. "I heard you've been busy playing hero. Pulled some poor stray out of the river, I'm told." Touching. Very, off-brand. Charles's grip tightened on the phone. "What do you know about this?" Victor chuckled. "Relax. Just neighborhood gossip. But tell me, how does it feel, saving someone so fragile? So dependent? Dangerous habit, forming attachments. You never know when they'll be used against you." The line went dead before Charles could respond. He stood frozen, pulse pounding. Was it coincidence Victor called? Or was it a message? A warning? Later that evening, as nurses wheeled Anna for tests, Charles noticed a black sedan parked across the street. Its windows tinted, its engine idling. He moved closer to the glass, watching. The car didn't budge. The detective returned, his expression taut. "Mr. Whitmore, we've pulled some preliminary reports. Hospital records don't line up. This girl, Anna, there are no files of her existence before yesterday. No birth certificate, no school records, nothing. It's as though she appeared from thin air." Charles turned sharply. "That's impossible. Children don't just disappear into life without a trail." "Unless someone made sure of it," the detective replied grimly. That night, the sense of threat thickened. A nurse carrying Anna's dinner tray stumbled, her face pale. Inside the food, Charles spotted traces of something off, a smear of peanut sauce, deadly for a child with allergies. The tray was snatched away, alarms called, but the implication chilled him. This wasn't negligence. This was intent. He sat by Anna's bed after the chaos settled, his hand resting gently on hers. She stirred faintly, eyes fluttering open. "Don't let them take me," she whispered, barely audible. His heart wrenched. "No one will take you. I promise." But as the monitors beeped steadily, and the shadow of that black sedan lingered beyond the window, Charles knew promises alone wouldn't be enough. Someone wanted Anna gone. And whoever it was, they had power, patience, and a personal vendetta. The game had shifted. No longer just a mystery, it was war. The hospital corridors echoed with the low hum of machines and the shuffle of rubber soles, but inside Anna's room, silence reigned. Charles sat by her side, fatigue carved into his face. He had cancelled every meeting, ignored every call. The empire he'd spent a lifetime building could collapse brick by brick, and still he would not leave her. Anna had been restless all evening. She stirred, whimpered, her little body fighting unseen battles in her dreams. Charles smoothed her curls gently, whispering reassurances he wasn't sure he believed. Then it happened. Her body convulsed. The monitor screamed in frantic beeps. Her throat tightened, her breaths coming in shallow, strangled gasps. Her small hands clawed at the sheets, eyes wide with terror. "Allergic reaction," a nurse shouted, rushing in. "She's seizing, get epinephrine." Chaos erupted. Staff swarmed the room, syringes and oxygen masks appearing in a blur. Charles stumbled back, heart hammering, watching as Anna's skin flushed, her lips swelling, her fragile chest heaving for air that would not come. "No, no, no, stay with me." His voice cracked, raw. He tried to move closer, but the nurses pushed him aside, working with desperate precision. The sound of her choking sobs carved into him, more excruciating than any boardroom defeat or financial ruin. The injection went in. Seconds crawled like hours. Then, release. Her breaths, ragged at first, began to steady. The monitors calmed. The crimson in her skin faded. Her small body, racked with trembling, sagged into exhaustion. The staff exhaled relief. One nurse muttered, "That was close. Too close." Charles stood frozen, every nerve vibrating with fury. He had seen the tray earlier, smelled the faint hint of peanuts in her food. He'd warned them. And yet somehow, it had reached her plate. That wasn't accident. That was intent. He sat again by her bed once the nurses cleared, his hands shaking. Anna's eyelids fluttered open. Weak, fragile, she lifted her gaze to him. "Don't let them take me again," she whispered, voice fractured but resolute. Again. The word detonated inside him. It wasn't just fear of the river, or fear of strangers. It was memory. Experience. Proof that whatever had happened to her before tonight had been far darker than anyone imagined. Charles clasped her hand in both of his, lowering his head until his forehead touched her knuckles. "I won't," he swore. "Not ever. They'll have to go through me." Outside the room, shadows lingered at the edge of glass walls. A man in a dark suit loitered by the nurse's station, watching too long before disappearing down the hall. This was no random misfortune. It was a hunt. And Anna wasn't meant to survive it. The storm that had nearly claimed Anna's life left a tremor in its wake. For days, Charles refused to leave her side, even when the doctors assured him she was stable. The questions that had haunted him since the river only grew louder, more insistent, clawing at his composure until the truth was no longer something he could wait for, it was something he had to seize. The detective returned, a folder tucked under his arm. "We need to know for certain, Mr. Whitmore. A DNA test could confirm paternity. Will you consent?" Charles's jaw tightened. Consent? He had already made the decision hours ago. If answers lay within a vial of blood and a sterile lab, then so be it. Anna blinked up at him, confused as nurses carefully collected swabs from her cheek. She didn't understand the weight of the moment, but she sensed the tension in the air. Her little hand clutched his sleeve as though grounding herself against the unknown. Memories flooded him as he signed the papers. Monica. Her laughter, her fire, the way she'd once whispered promises under a starlit sky. The day she told him she was pregnant. The fight that followed, his pride, her defiance, the bitter parting. Then the devastating news, a stillborn child. He'd buried that grief with silence, building towers of glass and steel over the grave of his regrets. But now, if that had been a lie. Hours dragged. Charles paced the hospital corridor, his reflection fractured in the polished floor. Every tick of the clock was a blade cutting deeper. Finally, the detective appeared, his face unreadable. He held the folder like it weighed more than stone. The results are in. Charles forced himself to stand still, though his pulse thundered. The detective opened the folder, scanned the page, and lifted his eyes. Paternity confirmed. 99.9% match. For a moment, the world fell silent. The hum of the hospital, the shuffle of footsteps, the distant cry of another child, all of it receded. Anna was his. The air left his lungs in a single, ragged exhale. He turned back toward the room, his gaze locking on the small figure curled in the hospital bed. Not a stranger. Not chance. His daughter. His blood. When he entered, Anna stirred, sensing him. She reached for him, sleepy eyes softening when he took her hand. "Daddy," she breathed, as though the word had always belonged to him. And for the first time, Charles did not flinch at it. He embraced it. "I'm here," he whispered, lowering himself to her level, brushing a damp curl from her forehead. "I should have been here all along." Tears burned behind his eyes, but he didn't fight them. The truth, undeniable and staggering, had reshaped everything. The mystery of the river, the whispers of the past, Victor's veiled threats, it all converged now into a single, merciless reality. Someone had stolen his daughter. Someone had stolen 6 years of her life, and 6 years of his. And Charles Whitmore, a man who had clawed his way to the top of the world, vowed silently that he would burn it all down to uncover who, and why. The revelation struck Charles like a tidal wave, but the storm was only beginning. News traveled faster than he could control. Within hours of the DNA results, a visitor was announced at the hospital front desk, a name he hadn't spoken aloud in years. Monica. He froze when he heard it, his chest tightening as though a hand had closed around his heart. For years, he had convinced himself she was gone to him, swallowed by time and distance. But here she was, demanding entry. When she walked into the hospital room, Charles felt the past slam into the present. Monica was older, her hair pulled back with threads of silver, her posture proud yet strained by grief. But her eyes, the same sharp, fire-lit eyes he had once loved, locked instantly on the small girl in the bed. "Anna," she whispered. The sound of her mother's voice stirred the child from sleep. Anna blinked, her gaze flickering between Charles and the woman now trembling at the doorway. When Monica stepped closer, her hands covering her mouth, tears spilled down her cheeks. Anna's little voice, weak but certain, answered, "Mommy." The dam broke. Monica rushed forward, collapsing at the bedside, gathering her daughter's fragile frame into her arms. The reunion was raw, unfiltered, a mother clinging to the miracle she thought she had lost forever, a child nestling instinctively into the arms that had once cradled her. Charles stood back, watching the embrace with a storm of emotions. Relief, guilt, longing, and something darker, anger. For years, he had believed her when she said their baby hadn't survived. He had grieved in silence, his pride too stubborn to seek her out, his heart too wounded to forgive. Now the truth stood before him. Monica had lived with the secret. She had raised their child, or at least tried, until someone had ripped Anna away. Why? His voice was low, dangerous. Why did you tell me she was dead? Monica turned, still cradling Anna. Pain etched her features. Because I thought she was. They told me she was stillborn. I buried an empty casket, Charles. Do you understand? They took her from me before I ever held her. The weight of her words cut through his fury. He saw not a betrayer, but a mother broken by the same lie that had shackled him. Silence thickened, broken only by Anna's soft breathing between them. She reached out her small hands, placing one on each of theirs, as though trying to knit the shattered pieces together. Charles's throat tightened. They lied to both of us. Monica nodded, her eyes fierce now through the tears. And someone is still trying to keep her from us. In that moment, the fractured lovers, once torn apart by pride, by time, by grief, found themselves united again. Not by romance, not by the past, but by the living, breathing miracle who bound them together. The reunion was not gentle. It was jagged, laced with blame and regret. But beneath it all was something stronger, resolve. For Anna's sake, they would fight. Together. Night cloaked the city in a shroud of steel and neon. From the rooftop of the hospital parking structure, Charles could see the black sedan again, idling, waiting, a predator's patience etched into its stillness. He clenched his fists. Enough. Victor Kane's shadow had lingered too long, poisoning every step since Anna's rescue. Now, with Monica back and the truth of Anna's bloodline confirmed, Charles no longer had the luxury of restraint. He would end this. The trap was set in an abandoned warehouse near the river, the same waters where fate had first intervened. Charles arrived with detectives hidden in the shadows, their radios crackling softly. Monica, against his protests, insisted on being nearby. "This isn't just your fight," she said firmly. "They stole her from me too." Headlights cut through the gloom. The sedan pulled up, doors opening with casual arrogance. Victor Kane stepped out, his tailored suit immaculate, his smirk sharp as a blade. "Well, Whitmore," he drawled, his voice echoing off rusted steel beams. "You've gone soft. Playing family man with a child who should have drowned. You never could see the bigger picture." Charles's fury simmered, but his tone was controlled. "You did this. You had her taken. You forged death records, erased her existence. Why?" Victor's laugh was cold, hollow. "Because you took everything from me. The contracts, the empire, the influence. I wanted you broken. What better way than to strip you of your legacy before it ever began?" He leaned closer, venom in his eyes. "She was never meant to survive. You weren't meant to find her." Monica's gasp echoed like a dagger across the space. Charles's jaw clenched so tight it ached. From the shadows, Anna's voice, tiny, trembling, carried farther than anyone expected. She had followed, slipping from Monica's grasp. "Why?" she asked, her small figure framed by the warehouse light. "Why did you hurt me?" Victor blinked, momentarily thrown. His mask slipped, cruelty flashing raw. "Because you were his." That was the final straw. Charles surged forward, years of suppressed rage exploding into motion. He caught Victor by the collar, shoving him back against a steel beam. "You touched my daughter," he snarled, every word vibrating with lethal promise. "And you will answer for it." Sirens wailed outside. The detectives swept in, weapons drawn, commands barked. Victor struggled, spitting curses, but the trap had closed. Steel cuffs clamped around his wrists. "You think this ends me?" he shouted as they dragged him toward the waiting cars. "You have no idea how deep this runs. You'll never keep her safe." His voice echoed as he was shoved into the darkness. Anna clung to Monica, trembling, her wide eyes fixed on Charles. He went to her, dropping to his knees, his hand trembling as he touched her cheek. "It's over," he said softly. He'll never hurt you again. But in the silence that followed, Charles felt the weight of Victor's warning. This battle was won, but the war, it had only begun. The hospital room was quieter now. The chaos of sirens, shouting, and confrontation had faded into memory, leaving only the soft rhythm of the heart monitor and the steady breathing of a little girl who finally slept without fear. Charles sat by Anna's bed, his suit wrinkled, his knuckles raw from the fight. Monica stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. For the first time in years, there was no hostility in her eyes, only exhaustion, and the fragile thread of hope. Anna stirred, blinking awake. When she saw them both, her lips curved into a sleepy smile. "Mommy." "Daddy," she whispered, her voice small but certain. The words bound the three of them together, fragile yet unbreakable. Charles leaned down, brushing a curl from her forehead. "We're here," he said, voice steady despite the weight in his chest. "And we're not going anywhere." Anna reached for the crayons again, her little fingers still clumsy but determined. She pressed the paper against her lap, sketching with quick strokes. When she held it up, Charles and Monica both froze. 3 figures, child, mother, father, drawn in bright colors beneath a sun that seemed to radiate off the page. In shaky letters, she had scrawled, "Family." Charles swallowed hard, his throat thick. He had built towers of steel and empires of glass, but nothing had ever felt as unshakable as that word, scribbled in crayon. "I'll protect this," he vowed softly, more to himself than to anyone else. "No matter the cost. No one will take you from me again." Monica nodded, her hand tightening on his. For the first time, there was no distance between them, only a shared vow, forged in pain and reborn in resolve. Outside the window, dawn crept over the horizon, painting the city in gold. But as Charles gazed out, the glow felt less like peace and more like a warning. Victor's words echoed in his mind, "You have no idea how deep this runs." He glanced back at Anna, her eyes finally closing in true, untroubled rest. For tonight, the danger was past. For tonight, their family was whole. But somewhere beyond the hospital walls, shadows lingered. Enemies remained. And Charles Whitmore knew the battle for his daughter's future had only just begun. Still, as he tucked the crayon drawing carefully into his jacket pocket, one truth settled firmly in his chest. Whatever storm awaited them, they would face it together.